Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of Foreign Affairs Throwdown, or FA Live, as we call it. Tonight's topic is state building, and we are delighted to have with us some of the world's foremost experts on the subject. Jim Dobbins has been there, done that, and written the books to tell the rest of us about it. Claire Lockhart is the muse of the Afghan counterinsurgency and state-building campaign, and is a major expert on the subject in both practice and theory. Bronwyn Bruton, having worked not only at the NED but also as an IAF at the Council on Foreign Relations, is a serious expert and author on the African side of things, and her Foreign Affairs article was one of our major recent hits on these topics, and they're going to help enlighten us about a really fascinating subject that is ironically not just sort of one of the most intellectually interesting subjects in the political science and foreign policy fields, but also right at the bleeding edge of American foreign policy practice at the moment in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. We're going to take a slightly different take this time than in the past. We're going to bring you guys into it more. We're going to have an interactive session this evening. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a poll that will essentially offer some questions for you guys to answer first. And then we'll have our discussion. And then we'll go back and ask the same questions again and have you vote a second time. And we'll compare whether there's any change whatsoever in people's opinions, which will be a testimony, I don't know what, to the persuasiveness of the various authors, or which one you think is more articulate or whatever. But it should be at least a kind of fun, interesting experiment. The little gizmos you have on your chairs are your voting mechanisms. And so what's going to happen basically is I'm going to read a question and the multiple choice answers, which will be displayed up on the screen. You'll have 15 seconds to vote using your handheld controller. Please press the button that corresponds to your answer. We'll see the results, and then we'll go on to the next question. So without further ado, let's get right to the Q&A. So the first question. U.S. efforts at state building in the Balkans, the greater Middle East, and elsewhere in recent years have 1. Help promote regional development, regional security, and economic and political development. 2, overextended the U.S. military and squandered resources that could have been better devoted elsewhere. 3, all of the above. So these things have been good for them, bad for us, or both simultaneously. Tick-tock, you have 15 seconds to vote 1, 2, or 3 on the first question. Okay. 50. Oh, okay. This is interesting. See, I knew there was a good reason I put that question there. Okay. So that's kind of fun. Okay. Question number 2. B. Should state building be a central element of U.S. policy in Afghanistan? 1. No, because efforts there should be primarily military, with other people doing state building, locals or other outside actors. 2. Yes, because state building is necessary for military efforts to succeed. 3. Yes, but only if the Afghan government gets its act together and undertakes dramatic reforms. Unfortunately, we don't have none of the above, so you can use these. Throw the bastards out isn't a good question. Okay, interesting. Okay. Question 3. The most important obstacle to American success in Afghanistan is A, widespread popular support for the enemy. B, the illegitimacy, ineffectiveness, and corruption of our local Afghan partners. C, insufficient American efforts. So your choices are the enemy, our friends, us. That's interesting. Okay. Okay. Next question. Should the United States increase its state-building efforts in troubled countries even where it is not engaged militarily? 1, yes, because state-building can help prevent turmoil and terrorism at the source. 2, no, because we don't know how to do it and shouldn't be mucking around in other countries' business. 3, yes, but only in partnership with allies and international institutions, like a good liberal internationalist would say. Jim, you're looking pensive. Jim doesn't like my questions. Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay. Next question. What is the proper relationship between state-building efforts and foreign aid? 1, they're independent tools directed at separate problems and should be discussed separately. 2, they complement each other and obviously should be done both together. 3, both are generally a waste of time. We encourage people to be honest about their actual feelings. This is an anonymous poll. Okay. And 15% think waste time. Okay. Fifth, finally, should U.S. state-building efforts in different countries work from a common playbook? Yes, because the basic elements of the problem and solution apply across cases, even if there's some details that are separate. 2, no, because every country's situation is different. 3, no, because we shouldn't be doing much state-building in the first place. Interesting. Okay, so this means that Claire, and Jim, your books, they're worthless because there's no good single textbook that we should use. And so, okay, excellent. Well, put your controllers under your chair, and we'll pick them up later. Let's get the screen up, and let's get on with the show. Guys, come on up here. Okay. Well, we will come back to the Q&A afterwards, but right now, let's get a little bit of discussion on the underlying subject. So, Claire, you have written. Let's start with. We'll go in order across the right to left here. You've written books on what state building involves. You're head of a foundation about increasing state effectiveness. What exactly is state building? What are we talking about this evening?
Well, I think state building is fundamentally about them and not about us. It's about a society regenerating its own governance arrangements, its own institutions. When we get state building wrong, it's when it's all about us. It's about us sending in people, sending in money, sending in things from the outside as if there's nothing there. But I think it's also about understanding what is the role of the state in the 21st century. It isn't about the kind of state building that might have been in the 19th century, because we're living in such a fundamentally different context.
Okay, meaning in what way? What were the old states like, and what are the new states that are not like them?
I think in previous incarnations of how statecraft was understood and what the state, it was fundamentally about providing security, and today it is also fundamentally about providing security, particularly in the parts of the world where that's missing. Citizens across the world, if you can't walk down to the end of the road without fear of being shot in the back of the head, it's security that you want most. But in today's world, particularly in a globalized world where everybody has a has access to a TV and sees living standards from across the world, expectations of what the state provides have fundamentally changed. Dr. Ghani and I, in our book, say that there are 10 functions of the state today. It could be 7, it could be 11, but we're seeing much higher expectations of both of living standards and of what people expect their lives to be like.
So it's security. So in the old days, you just had to provide security. Now you have to provide security, but a lot of other things as well.
A lot of other things as well. It's about management of public finances, it's about provision of healthcare, education, and it's about management of the market. What's the right balance between the state and the market in the 21st century? And that's a question that applies as much in a Somalia and Afghanistan as it does in a US or a Germany today.
Okay. Jim, you've written books, including the Beginner's Guide to Nation Building. What do you think state building is? And by the way, do you think state building, nation building, all these things are separate phenomena, same phenomena, different labels, or what?
Well, I think Americans tend to treat nation and state interchangeably. Europeans who are used to dealing with multinational states tend to make a distinction between nation building, which is creating a sense of identity in a society, perhaps a divided society, and state building, which is about building governmental capacity. In many cases, both are necessary, and so it's a fine distinction. I do think that the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan has tended to hijack these terms and skew the debate. State building, as it's been used in the post-Cold War era, or nation building, whichever one prefers, really is a prescription for dealing with failed states or failing states. And these are states typically that are emerging from civil war, not from invasions and occupations, but from civil wars. Somalia being, the classic case of a failed state. But Haiti, Libya, Sierra Leone, not Libya, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Cambodia. I mean, I could name a couple of dozen of these states that fragmented, Yugoslavia, that fragmented. So how do you restore stability, security, and functioning societies? Clearly, if the state has failed, you need to reconstitute a functioning state, and that's state building by definition. And so I don't think in that sense it's a very controversial concept. If you have a state that's descended into chaos, and if the international community is going to help reconstitute that a state that can provide services to that society, then state building is clearly the path. How you do it, what instruments you use, the degree to which a peacekeeping component, a military component, is essential. These are where the debate tends to take place. And I do believe, based on now several dozen experiences since 1989, that we have enough of a case history so that we can make some generalizations that are valid, even if you accept that each of these cases also has unique features.
Brahman, we tend to think of state building as a question of political order, and we tend to think of the creation or emergence of a centralized dominant state as the chief vehicle for providing that order, whether it's an indigenous one or one that's created midway from the outside. You've dealt with a lot of countries in which sort of you have a different situation and almost in which you have different prescriptions. Does political order require a centralized national government with tentacles throughout the entire country?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And when you're talking about Somalia, it's one that comes to mind immediately. Somalia is a country that, when it's experienced centralized government, it's generally been at wars or in a period of great civil unrest. The Siad Barre military dictatorship was one of the worst periods in Somali history, the most brutal. He effectively carried out a genocide on a significant portion of the population. And today, under the transitional federal government, which is only notionally a government, I should point out, once again, the city of Mogadishu has been absolutely leveled. So the Somali experience of the state has really not been a positive one. And you're dealing with a situation in which possibly a majority, although we don't have public opinion polling. This system would be great in Somalia. But we don't know, but we can assume, I think, that a significant amount of the population is going to consider this central state with some degree of fear and skepticism. And it's not only that, the central state is difficult, but that when the Somalis talk about reconstituting a state, they often mean parts of Ethiopia and Kenya and Djibouti and Somaliland. So when we're trying to persuade them to rebuild, we're actually, in a way, summoning irredentist ambitions. So we have different concepts of what their state should look like. And I think that immediately raises questions about, can we make any assumptions about what nation building should look like?
So can you have political order can you have a sustainable, healthy political order in a reasonably modern way without a centralized state?
Strangely enough, when the Somalis, in the period after the Civil War, after Black Hawk Down and the withdrawal of humanitarian forces, everyone thought that the state was going to explode, that Somalia would just descend into conflict. But in fact, within several years, the conflict had reduced. Somalia's economic indicators became as good as or comparable to better than neighboring countries. And the extremist groups that had been allied with al-Qaeda disappeared from the country. So it's really a situation in which, in the absence of a state-building intervention, things actually got better. The history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it's a good question to ask in the current context.
Well, actually, let's bring you guys in on this. I mean, you've talked about state building from the bottom up rather than the top down, and indigenous rather than external. Is it, in a place like Afghanistan, people have said, we shouldn't be trying to build up the central government in Kabul. We should be trying to create some kind of compact or regionalize it or localize it. Do you need to have a strong centralized government along a sort of classic European model to have political order?
I think, and this is where I think it has to fit the context. And in many places, just an indigenous solution isn't going to work and empirically hasn't worked, and it's about getting the design of the partnership right. I think sometimes we get trapped in a false debate between is it about centralization or is it about decentralization. If we take a step back, it's about looking at which function should be performed at which level. If it's about who prints the currency and who regulates the money supply, well, you don't want 364 districts each printing their own currency, of course. So that is a centralized function. If it's about who manages $10,000 projects to rebuild the irrigation system, then that's down to the village. So it's about finding the right fit. And if we look at that, then I think we get away from either centralized or decentralized or top-down and bottom-up. It's both.
Excellent. It's sort of like the subsidiarity concept in the EU kind of thing.
Absolutely. How to make sure that the decision is taken at the lowest level possible. One great example of how this works in practice is a program called National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan. A block grant to the center. So the trust fund is very centralized with a dual key system. Block grants given to every village. It's now in 28,000 villages. And the villagers decide on their own money. When they want to aggregate upwards, they do. So 187 villages got together to build an irrigation system. 37 villages got together to build a maternity hospital. So you find the right level to do the right task.
Jim, what's your take on this? And particularly in the security arena, can you have a sort of decentralized form, or do you need some kind of central provider, a central leviathan of some kind?
Well, there are European states with weak central governments, Switzerland being a good example, Belgium being another. So there certainly are models where central governments have very limited spheres of activity. I think unless you want people living in a sort of a Hobbesian state of nature, governments are constituted, to provide certain essential services, of which security is the most essential, because without it, none of the other services end up meaning very much. But increasingly, it provides basic education, access to health care, roads, electricity, water, these kinds of things, obviously, that can be provided at the local level as well. But without some kind of human organization, these services aren't going to be provided. I think the problem in dealing with failed states in which the existing order has collapsed in civil war, anarchy, or whatever, is twofold. First of all, many of them would be highly susceptible to federalism in the sense that they are often states built on a number of different nationalities or ethnic or religious groups, and federalism would seem to be made to order. The problem is most of these societies don't have any historical experience with federalism and tend to regard it with skepticism. So, for instance, there were lots of people who thought that the Iraqis, and for that matter the Afghans, really ought to have federal systems, but the fact is they don't want them. They don't want them because they don't understand them, they're afraid of them, they're a Western concept, and so you're probably not going to be able to force them into those molds, even though they make sense. The second is that they're not really capable of returning to the traditional forms of government, whatever they were, because those forms have collapsed and lost credibility. And the only exception I can think of is we liberated Kuwait, we turned it back over to the royal family. Nobody talked about holding elections. They paid for the liberation, they got the country back, and everybody was happy. The international community was happy, the royal family was happy, and the Kuwaitis were happy because they still had legitimacy. That's the only case. If you go into Haiti or Sierra Leone or Liberia or the Congo or Sudan or Afghanistan or Iraq, nobody is going to regard the previous regime as acceptable. The international community is not going to regard it as acceptable. The population isn't going to regard it as acceptable. So whatever traditional forms of authority there may have been no longer have a purchase. And so holding elections, basing authority on representative government, one man, one vote, really is the only, assuming the international community doesn't want to govern these places forever, really is the only way in which to reconstitute an authority that the population will regard as legitimate.
Okay. Political order in troubled societies, in strange places, faraway places with funny names. Americans have a lot of problems, massive budget deficits. We can't even get our own health care act together. The administration is overburdened. Our own institutions are not really working much. Why should, however interesting, hypothetically, curious this subject is, why, and however important to the locals, why should Americans care about this, and what, if anything, can the American government do about this?
Well, I think you can make a good economic case for state building generally. As I said, I think the argument in this country gets hijacked by the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people tend to identify those and the cost with those and therefore dismiss it. But the fact is that states in civil war are states in negative economic growth. That is, a state that's having a civil war is going to produce less each year than it did the year before. It's going to depress its own GDP. It's going to depress the GDP of every country around it. Not as much, but all of those countries are going to suffer from having the chaos, the refugees, the endemic disease, the terrorism, and the commercial disruption of having a failed state on their doorstep. The actual costs of UN peacekeeping missions and of multinational assistance in various forms of state building in these kinds of societies is rather low when compared with the cost to the international economy of allowing these states to continue to be in chaos. The fact is that relatively small armed forces made up largely of countries, of third world countries, and relatively modest levels of assistance have turned around a dozen or more countries. And countries like some of the ones I named, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Cambodia, and 4 or 5 others are living in peace today, and almost all of them are living under freely elected representative governments because UN troops came in, separated the combatants, disarmed the contending factions, secured economic growth, promoted the development of political parties, organized elections, and then stayed around long enough to make sure the resultant governments could take hold.
Bronwyn and Claire, would you basically agree with that argument for why this is something people should care about? Or are there other reasons, or do you disagree with what he said?
I would play devil's advocate just for the sake of doing it. So, I think one concern in the African context, and this applies to a lot of countries, of which Somalia is only one, is that many African states simply do not have the tax revenues to support a central regime. And when you start off by creating a central government, be it in Ethiopia or Somalia, you're in a sense raising the specter of an almost perpetual dependency on the international aid community. I mean, Ethiopia, for example, gets 80% of its budget, its federal budget, from donations. And, of course, you have a huge debt burden also that develops from this. And I think that there's some question about, especially in a place like Somalia, where 60% of the population is illiterate, and that's an optimistic estimate. Whether forming a central state and then hoping that they can link themselves into the global economy is necessarily the most logical solution to their problem. So,
Claire, people have said that about Afghanistan as well, which is that the state we're giving them and the security forces we're envisioning are something that's way more than the Afghan regime is ever going to be able to pay for itself. So is this just basically sort of benevolent neocolonialism paid for permanently from the outside?
Well, I think, if we look at these places or these contexts in terms of a sovereignty gap, we have an international order which is dependent, where we assume that countries are sovereign. Dr. Ghani and I think there are these 10 factors of sovereignty, and if we had to boil it down to an essence, it's the capability of the society to raise enough revenue to pay for the services the citizens expect of it. So it's that revenue self-sufficiency that's absolutely critical for sustainability if we don't want these places to be a permanent ward of the donor community. I agree absolutely with the ambassador that the reasons that all of us need to care about disorder and chaos in these places are the enormous costs in humanitarian terms, in terms of the people and the suffering. And I think the current debate's got away from that. The basic cost in human suffering and the reasons that we should be compassionate about it. In hard security terms, we should worry about it because the security threats are there. And in economic terms, the cost to the global economy and the cost to the US and the cost to the world of these places failing is inordinately high, and the cost of having the right solution is better. I think the good news is that there are ways that these places can be dealt with much, much cheaper than what we're doing at the moment. The way that we're applying military force, but more importantly, the way we're applying aid is not working, and we're paying far too much. Coming on to foreign aid, particularly, we're spending billions of dollars in many of these places on private companies and NGOs with enormous budgets and little accountability, when instead we should be looking at how does that country grow its own economy, raise its own revenue, and pay for its own services. Many of these contexts only spend about 10 or 20% of their own domestic budgets. So the central question is how do you get, and it's a boring topic, it's about accountancy, how do you get the public finance system of the country working properly?
Jim, you say these things have been relatively easy and relatively cheap. She says it can be done even more cheaply. It's funny because I look around at the most recent American interventions and they seem like royal screw-ups that have cost vast amounts of money and produced very few positive results. Why, if it's possible to do this well, competently, relatively cheaply, do we keep screwing up?
Well, I wouldn't say Bosnia and Kosovo were screw-ups. I'd say they're still somewhat dependent on international aid, but the Balkans are at peace and have been at peace now for more than a decade, 15 years in the case of Bosnia. So, I think if you're just talking about the American experience, there are successful cases as well as more controversial ones. I think there is a difference between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, and one is, on average, 10 times more expensive than the other. The definition is peacekeeping is consensual. The parties have stopped fighting briefly. They're exhausted. They're prepared to invite in a referee, accept an international mediation and an international peacekeeping force, the purpose of which is to make sure that the parties actually implement the peace agreement they've agreed to. Those are conditions for a peacekeeping force. That's what the UN usually requires before it sends troops in. And if you have those basic prerequisites, then the costs and challenges are more limited. And basically, you're at that point guarding against recidivism. If, on the other hand, you are going to have to mount an invasion before you initiate the peacekeeping because the parties aren't prepared to stop fighting, haven't reached an agreement, or for some other reason, then you don't have the advantage. You, the intervening force, don't have the advantage of impartiality that the UN usually enjoys. And as the result, it requires to succeed, and it can succeed. It has succeeded. Germany, Japan after the Second World War, Bosnia, Kosovo. It requires, on average, our studies suggest about 10 times more manpower and 10 times more money. So it's much more expensive. Now, there are times when you're simply not prepared to let them fight it out and wait until they've reached exhaustion, at which point it becomes much more cost-effective to intervene. And that's one of the reasons why people have been very frustrated that the international community hasn't sorted out Darfur. Well, the fact is that it would be very expensive to go in and force them to stop fighting, and nobody's been willing to do that. They do seem to be stopping fighting now, and the peacekeeping force has a good chance of preventing them from resuming. But it's been a difficult and costly 10 years, but probably not as costly as going in and bombing them into submission and then occupying the territory.
So the choice is sort of let them fight it out with all the horrors that involves, or go in and do it yourself and sit on them in a sort of benign imperial invention and hope that eventually it works.
And accept the higher costs.
In
addition, scale matters. Bosnia, population of 3 million. Kosovo, a population of 2 million. Afghanistan, a population of 33 million. Iraq, a population of 25 million. So 10 times bigger. And logically, it would require 10 times more troops and 10 times more money. But we put 50,000 troops into Kosovo, a society of 2 million, most of whom loved us. So that would have scaled that up. That's 500,000 or 600,000 for Iraq or Afghanistan. We didn't do that.
So we can do it almost sort of seriously, but it's a lot of investment for a small community, and so for really big countries, you can't really do it easily. So it's not like there's a model on the shelf you could do Sudan. There's no model on the shelf you could easily take off.
You can do peacekeeping in a big country, but peace enforcement, no.
So Congo is screwed, basically.
Until the conditions for peacekeeping apply, which they do in most of the Congo, but not all of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a very bleak pic. Well, it's both encouraging and bleak. Encouraging for small, easy problems in small places we can help, and big problems in big, nasty places we can't do much about. Is that basically what you guys are saying?
Let someone else talk. I'm monopolizing.
I'm a little bit more cautiously optimistic. I think if we look now at the case of Afghanistan, one of the misperceptions is that Afghanistan has been at war consistently for the last 8 years. If we pass it out a little bit more, there was a war that was finished. It was started in October 2001 and was finished in November 2001. The Taliban had gone. Then there was pretty much a peace agreement. It wasn't called a peace agreement. It was the Bonn Agreement to establish legitimate institutions. And for about 4 or 5 years, the main effort was somewhere in between reconstruction, state building, and peacekeeping. But a very small number of troops were committed, and they were confined to Kabul. So what the Afghans requested was peacekeeping forces across the country and the other cities. That didn't happen. But perhaps even more fatally, the investment on the civilian side didn't happen. Aid came, and humanitarian aid came, but most of that aid, I'd say 80 or 90% of it, actually stayed in the Beltway. It went to companies and it went to NGOs. Most of it stayed in the US and European capitals. 20% of each level may have only gone on overheads, but by the time you've subcontracted 4 or 5 times down the chain, very little's getting to the context. What didn't happen was funding the civilian institutions that did exist in the country. So back in 2001, too, there was a functioning civil service. The Taliban had just been the top there. There were 240, I went around the country, there were 240,000 civil servants, policemen, teachers, nurses, doctors who'd been there since the 60s. $20 million went to pay the salaries. So we couldn't pay teachers, doctors even $50 a month. They left. So in fact, what we've seen is an exercise in state destruction sponsored by the international community because we didn't resource the civilian institutions. I think it would have cost $200 or $300 million to get it right. So That's a bleak picture. Optimistically, it wouldn't have taken very much investment. And I think if we look back at where countries have transformed in the last 2 or 3 decades, what were the key factors of success? It was leadership and management of the national leaders. Where that comes from is a very important question. I don't think we know the answer. But it was about investment in human capital of the people of the country, vocational training, higher education, secondary schools. We don't do that now. We do primary education. We stop at the age of 11. How are countries going to manage themselves if we only educate to the age of 11? And it was about investment in job creation, domestic firms and so on. So if we look at the cases of Singapore, of Spain, of the States and the American South, all these cases, those were the factors, and I think we need to learn those lessons. If we do, then I think it's possible.
Okay, this raises an absolutely fascinating methodological question, and I can't believe I just said methodological in an FA event, but still, what you're saying is you can't just code the Afghan case based on what happened, because there was another path that could have been taken that would have led to a fundamentally different outcome. In some ways, Bronwyn's Somalia work, people coded it as a failure, but then when it was supposedly a failure, it righted itself without external involvement in a dramatic way. So that could be how do you actually, I mean, Jim, you study these things, you do the history of the cases. How do you take into account the counterfactual paths that could have happened? When you say in Afghanistan, I mean, according to Claire, it didn't have to be the disaster that it is, or the mess that it is, at least, because if it had been done properly, it would have been a success.
And in 2005, just to clarify, when a group of Afghans came over to Washington and European capitals and said, look, we think this is going to collapse, leaders at the time were saying, no, we're bringing our troops home, it's all stable now. So for a period of time, it at least appeared to be a success.
So how do we draw proper lessons from history if the history itself is in dispute because there are other paths that weren't taken?
I don't know that. I mean, at least, within the academic literature, there's not all that much disagreement except on details. I think we, at RAND, have looked back at cases over the last 60 years, since 1945, established 2 basic criteria for success. Most important one is the place at peace today, or has civil war resumed? And the second one is it being governed by a representative, freely elected government? And so you can divide the several dozen cases since the Second World War into by those 2 criteria, and then you look at what the strategies were by the intervening powers, normally international coalitions, and determine what seems to have worked and what seems not to have worked. And there is a set of best practices. The UN has established a best practices unit. It's created a doctrine. The U.S. has been more haphazard in that regard. The Clinton administration, which began this really in the post-Cold War era, conducted 4 operations and got steadily better. Somalia was a complete failure. Haiti was a well-run but of little enduring value. Bosnia and Kosovo were of more enduring value. But it didn't pass that expertise on to its successor. Its successor was critical of state building and nation building and came in determined to do it not at all, or if necessary, at least to do it very differently. And so it too had to go through the same learning curve. And if you look at U.S. performance in Iraq in 2003 and then in 2007, you say, well, the Bush administration got a lot better at this. But it took them 8 years to get better at it. I think we're fortunate that Obama didn't go back to the bottom again, but built on what the Bush administration had achieved. And there's much more continuity in the way he's approached these than the way the last 2 administrations have. And if we're lucky, we will create a cadre of experts with a continuity of experience and create a doctrine, as the UN has done, for the conduct of these operations based on best practices.
So a sort of stable of experienced imperial managers to actually carry out our interventions and make them work over the time. Let me ask a couple of questions before turning it over to the audience for their questions. First, we hear sometimes about, Americans are always like talk about their own screw-ups, their own failures, their own successes. There's a whole world out there, and there's a sense that multilateralism, international legitimacy, international institutions are important to this process. How important is the multilateral dimension to this, to these efforts? Can the U.S. do it by itself if it does it right, or is what we do less important than who we do it with and the legitimacy that comes from backing of a serious international institution? So it's open to any of you.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't mind sort of jumping in on that. I think the multilateral approach is very, very important, particularly when you're talking about a situation and when the actions of any one particular country might be perceived as partisan. The United States, for example, in Africa has its own agenda, and having the backing of the United Nations or the African Union in the sense that there's more than a single agenda at play is very important. At the same time, what constantly has been occurring to me when I've been listening to this dialogue is we talk about nation building and cases where there's been successes. And what seems really clear to me is that there's nation building and there's nation creating. And we're talking about the successes of nation building. You're talking about starting from a fairly good place. And when we've tried in cases like Somalia and Haiti to really work on creating a government from scratch, that's where we haven't succeeded very well. And often that has a lot to do with the amount of resources that come into play. I mean, creating a state not only requires that you somehow motivate a population to pursue this goal, but it also is tremendously expensive. And I can't imagine that any single country, including the United States, can really fund that. So it has to be a collective effort at bottom.
Would you guys agree on that, the basic, just multilateralism?
I think so. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly in the Afghan context, but also now in looking at the real tragedy in Haiti, on the coordination problem. And often a solution to the coordination problem is to put one country in charge, and that's often, if not always, people are going to revert to the US as the superpower and the country with the resources and clout to do that. Having said that, if we're looking at a growing caseload of countries that are in chaos and disorder and have governance problems, and depending on which index you look at, it's somewhere between 40 and 60 countries, the thought of America leading on each of those, especially in the current economic climate, is just not feasible. So I think, therefore, the imperative to look at smarter and perhaps cheaper, more cost-effective ways of approaching these countries and being much more catalytic mechanisms rather than direct management is important, and looking at ways to organize collective efforts through different ways of forming alliances, not to mention the BRICS and new players in the aid and foreign policy agenda through emerging powers. We haven't yet mentioned the role of China in Africa, for example. So looking at new players and how they might engage with the challenge, and also looking to multilateralism. On the UN, I mean, if you read the Charter today, never has it been more relevant. We need the UN. We couldn't reinvent it today if we had to. Yet it's an organization in crisis, and I think particularly the role of the specialized agencies and the lack of accountability. If we follow the money, I think we'd all be shocked. And this is an agenda not only of the right, but as much of the left, to bring accountability to UN agencies, I think not least in the case of Somalia. I've been receiving emails from Mogadishu saying, please help us build a public finance system so the UN agencies stop stealing all our money. So the huge imperative to bring accountability to the UN agencies. And I think to bring back the World Bank and IMF and some of the development banks and the role of economics, regional economics, and the way that can play a really important role in peacekeeping itself. I interviewed recently many SRSGs who'd led peacekeeping efforts in the last 10 years, and all of them said that their biggest... Special Representative Secretary General, the UN representative, and all of them said that their biggest mistake was to think that economics could wait for 10 years. Instead, what you got was the formation of a criminal mafia elite. You didn't create jobs. So bringing the World Bank, IMF into this space in the right way, I think, is critical.
One last question from me before we turn it over to you guys. As one of the questions indicated, if you take a look at Afghanistan, our local partners there seem to be part of the problem rather than perhaps part of the solution. What happens when your local allies are themselves corrupt, quasi-authoritarian, not particularly effective how do you manage to encourage your friends, even at the same time that you're defeating your enemies?
Well, if you had competent, honest governments, you wouldn't have to be there in the first place. So I think you have to assume that if you're talking about state building, you're talking about working in an environment in which the existing indigenous institutions are weak and to non-existent. In the case of Afghanistan, they were non-existent 8 years ago. This is the problem. It's not an aberration. It's not, well, gee, how can we possibly succeed with a corrupt, incompetent government? The governments are always corrupt and incompetent, and yet there is a reasonable success rate. If by success you mean the place hasn't gone back into civil war, it continues to hold elections, and the people who get elected, get to govern for 4 or 5 years before there's a new election. Those aren't very high standards, but they are important standards, and they're standards that are consistently met in many of these countries, including virtually all of the ones that I've named. It's particularly difficult, obviously, if you're in a counterinsurgency environment, which you're in Afghanistan and Iraq, which exacerbates the problem and drives the costs up very significantly.
And you're not saying that just because you personally picked Karzai. What would you say about that question of how do you reform your enemies even as you're defeating? How do you reform your friends even as you're defeating your enemies?
I think it's the greatest challenge in these contexts. It's a really, really hard question. And I think the key to it, very difficult to operationalize, is a concept of accountability. It comes back to that boring topic of public finance, a lot of it. And a lot of it, I think, instead of having global leaders discuss the question of corruption, we go back to the technocratic element. Of course, it's political, but it's about revenue and budget and procurement and expenditure. How, with a recent discovery in Afghanistan of possibly up to $1 trillion worth of mineral assets, how are those going to be? What's going to be the right framework so that the benefit of that goes to the population of the country to pay for their future services for the population? So it's those types of questions that are really critical. And I think the hope is, in so many of these countries, we're looking at statistics of 60 to 65% of the country being under 25. There's a new generation coming. It's a very different generation, and it comes again back to investing in the universities, the vocational training, and investing in the youth, and broadening our concept of what leadership means. Often in these places, we always look at one leader. No one leader runs any country. And I think we need to broaden the telescope to look at broader conceptions of institutions, the cabinet, the ministries, and the parliament and civil society, and take a much wider view on what leadership means.
Okay. Well, speaking of the next generation, you want to jump in on this problem?
Yeah.
Go for it.
I mean, I think basically that this is a key question in the East African context, because in practice, when you're talking about nation building in East Africa, what it comes down to is a process of picking a winner and defeating a loser. And once you've gone through this picking of the winner, and it turns out you have someone that you're willing to work with, it becomes very, very hard to rein them in. A phrase you constantly hear in the Somali context is that this government that we've created there is the only game in town. And it's just perceived that there's no alternative to working with them. And it's hugely problematic, because once you're the only game in town, you don't really have any incentive to do anything except what's in your own best interest. In the Ethiopian context, they're coming up on elections, and you have a government which is no longer a democracy by any real meaning of the word. I mean, there's people, opposition leaders being arrested, opposition leaders being stabbed. There's no freedom of the press. And yet the U.S. government, because Ethiopia is so important in our counter-terror struggle, and because it feels that it has no leverage, is really not even able to publicly criticize the Ethiopian government. And when you get to that stage, when that's such a real dynamic, you have to ask whether state building doesn't start looking a lot, in a sense, like Cold War politics or colonialism even. And again, I understand East Africa, is fundamentally different than other contexts because it's so under-resourced. And nation building is really, it's almost not even fair to call it nation building, I think. It's another point to bring up. But
so it's the old friendly tyrant problem in a different guise, right?
It feels like that, yeah.
Well,
I do think it's worth mentioning, though, that that the incidence of conflict in Africa have gone down dramatically over the last 20 years. We read about the chronic cases, Congo, Sudan, and Somalia. But the fact is that the number of conflicts in Africa are probably a third of what they were 15 years ago. The number of people getting killed in Africa as a result of civil war is probably reduced even more dramatically. And this is almost entirely the result of UN. The peacekeeping component of those successes has almost been entirely under UN leadership.
Speaking of the next generation, we're going to take questions now, and our first one will come from Twitter, from spedlap.com. What is the connection between state building and the rule of law and rule of law development programs? Any of you want to handle that? Okay. Is that one of your 10 things you have to do, Claire?
It is, and in the first draft of Dr. Ghani and my paper, it was reviewed by the American Bar Association. And their top comment was that this was actually the first function. I think we agree with them. It's the glue that binds the rest of the system. And I think often we conceive, and rule of law programs often conceive of rule of law in its organizational terms. It's about training judges and building courthouses and managing the flow of cases. And I think we need to see, and that's important, but I think we need to see rule of law as a much broader concept. It was interesting to me that I think, this is hearsay, but during World War II, there was a Wilton Park meeting convened by the US government and the British government. And they brought together 20 law professors, put them in a room and said, in 41, and say, you start planning for post-war Germany. But it was lawyers who were going to do that. They were going to look at the constitution and the administrative system and the personnel issues. By contrast, when the Bonn Agreement was being put together, the people in the room were mainly wheat logisticians thinking about how to organize free wheat distribution across the country. And there was scarcely a lawyer in sight. And I think looking at constitutionalism, law, and organizations is really critically important and to the enterprise of state building. And it's something that we ignore too much at the moment.
Okay. Our next question will come from Facebook, from John Hemmings. What is going to be the role of the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization at state in all this? Is state going to be given more power and funding in the U.S.'s state-building efforts?
Well, I think clearly the civil element in these operations is essential. Deploying military forces in the aftermath or in the midst of a conflict can open a window of opportunity for change, but the soldiers don't bring about the changes. It's people who know how to promote civil society, promote a free press, encourage the development of political parties, restart the economy, hold elections. It's people who know to do those sorts of things that are going to make the intervention worthwhile, so that when the soldiers leave, the situation doesn't fall back into chaos. And so the civilian component, state, USAID in the American case, is clearly critical to the success of these operations. On the other hand, whereas the military, by definition, has a surge capacity, has lots of people who are standing around waiting for a crisis, and therefore you can rapidly react to a new situation by flooding it with people who were not doing anything except training a week earlier. That's not true for any civilian agency. And every civilian agency of the U.S. government and of any government, everybody's fully employed. And you can only send them to do a new problem by stopping them doing what they're doing. You have to say, okay, whatever you're doing, it's not as important as going to Haiti this week. You're going to go to Haiti this week, and therefore you're going to stop whatever else you're doing. That's obviously harder than taking people who are training for a contingency and then moving them off. And so that's the difficulty. But state has gotten more money and more people over the last year or two. It is currently in the throes of a review as to whether or not it should also reorganize itself in some fundamental way, it and USAID, to improve its capacity. And the results of that review are not out yet, but they're sort of imminent.
Okay, with that, you want to jump in on this,
just
Roman?
really quickly. I work in the NGO community, and I have to say every every NGO, human resources person I know is desperately trying to hire people with military experience because they expect in the future it'll all be DoD.
Okay. So it's over here. Yes, right over here. Wait for the microphone, stand up, state your name, and keep your questions concise.
Hello, Joe Gini, a reporter for the Yomiuri Daily News. I was wondering, how do you go about state building in a country where there is no nation, where you have ethnic cleavages and no history of national unity, post-colonial borders, a country like Sudan, for example, or Iraq, for that matter? If there's no country, how do you build a state when nobody even wants to be in the same country with other people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is the key problem, the key issue with Somalia, which, curiously is one of the most ethnically homogenous nations in Africa. But the country is deeply divided over very fundamental questions like whether the state should be secular or Islamic, whether it should incorporate secessionist areas like Somaliland. Basically, there have been, depending on how you count, some 14 or 15 efforts to reconstruct the state. They've all failed. Just failed categorically. And so the answer would be, I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, the argument that I've put forward is that at this stage, you can't start reconstructing a state because it's simply putting the cart before the horse. There has to be some kind of a national, I think you would call it a national vision or visioning exercise. And if it's not there, then can it be created by the international community? And I would say the answer is no. Okay. Some other plan has to be put in place.
Are you guys that bleak?
I agree, absolutely. There needs to be, the critical factor is the national consensus. Going back to the great American philosopher John Dewey, the state's just a mechanism that does what a citizenry wants it to do. How does the citizenry decide? It comes about as a result of public discussion. Some of the mechanisms to reach that consensus in the Afghan context were the Loya Jirga. They have their own indigenous way of coming together, building consensus on what they wanted to do. The 2004 Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, district head after district head stood up and talked about what they wanted for their district. And it was remarkable, I think, to the participants, they remarked on it on themselves, that actually what the people of Kandahar wanted and the people of Badakhshan and the people of Baghdis actually wasn't that different. Mm-hmm. They actually all found that they wanted their wives not to die in childbirth. They did want their daughters in school. So it was about basic education, healthcare, and irrigation. And from the bottom up, you could begin to build that consensus on what they wanted the state to do for them and how it would operate. But I think it comes, how do you organize that kind of civil society dialogue, that process of building a national consensus, piece by piece, issue by issue over time, that's really the hope and what we see has worked. In Nepal over the last few years, I think stability that's been reached has in part been because of that national internal dialogue.
Jim, what are you?
Well, clearly if there are severe ethnic or religious or linguistic cleavages, it makes the task more difficult. And in some cases, it makes it virtually impossible. Yugoslavia broke up into constituent elements. But it doesn't necessarily make it impossible, and there are many cases where multi-ethnic states have stayed together. In some cases through power-sharing arrangements in which constitutions allocate a certain degree of power to each ethnic group. The Lebanese constitution is one example in that regard. In some cases, as a result of external pressures, Bosnia is kept together because the neighboring states and the European Union and the NATO aren't going to allow it to fragment again, and so it's not an option. And they're big enough and Bosnia is small enough so that you can enforce that particular edict. In other cases, it's more difficult. It certainly drives up the costs and the complexities of state-building missions. But as I say, it doesn't make it impossible in most cases.
Okay, yes, in the back there.
Thank you for the opportunity. I was born and raised in Iran and in the ghettos of Iran, but for the last 30-some years I have been in a very sophisticated academic environment in the United States. I believe the reason you all are saying that we are failing in nation building is because the goal has not been nation building. The real goal has been nation molding. whether it is Afghanistan, Iraq, and hopefully it won't be Iran. We are engaged in nation molding. A gentleman asked a question about Iraq. How could you make a nation out of nothing? Iraq has been a sophisticated nation for centuries. My gosh, we are engaged in nation molding, and as long as we are engaged in that, we will fail.
Okay, is this just all a sort of new version of imperialism of some kind?
Well, I think there are a couple of differences between the post-Cold War nation building and pre-World War II colonialism. One, of course, is the time span. Most nation builders intend to complete the operation within 5 to 10 years. It's not generational, whereas to the extent colonial powers actually had a real mission of creating viable independent states, and they said they did, but one questioned how sincere they were. They saw it as a generational. Yes, in 5 or 10 generations, these people will be free. And in the meantime, we're serving as their trustees. Nobody thinks that this is going to last more than 5 or 10 years.
How long have we been in Bosnia?
Secondly, the U.S. is out of Bosnia. Europeans are still there. But secondly, there's no profit in it. Colonialism was conceived of as a profit-making enterprise. The colonial powers actually believed, perhaps not accurately in some cases, that they would profit and gain power and prestige through colonialism. I don't think any Western population thinks that nation building is a profit-making enterprise, or even one that necessarily boosts their prestige and power.
At the same time, in places like Somalia, a major push for nation building is the presence of oil. And I think that there are people in the Niger Delta who would suggest that the structure of government is it's an important way of determining whether the resources that are present in the country go to them or go to bank accounts in Switzerland. So there is definitely money to be made, and I think especially among African populations, there's a perception that nation building can in some respects be an attempt to control those vital resources. So there is a danger. I mean, I'm not saying that should be. I'm not saying that's the intention. But I think occasionally that's the effect. Certainly it's the perceived effect.
Well, I think it may be the perception, but I think any studies would indicate that it's a losing enterprise if you're in it to make money.
And I'd certainly agree that where efforts fail is when outsiders arrive in a particular context, a particular time, and assume that it's a tabula rasa, assume that it's a blank slate. Mm-hmm. And we see this again and again in the reports. There's nothing there. We have to bring it in from the outside. And of course, in most, if not all contexts, they are civilizations with ancient histories, traditions of governance, indigenous institutions, many of which had high, if we applied standards, measurement standards to them, reach very, very high standards, even if they don't look recognizable to Western standards. So I think starting the lessons very clearly is to start with a reading of the context. And instead of looking for what isn't there, look at the tremendous assets, the human capital, the traditions that do exist. If we start from that perspective, I think efforts are much more successful.
Actually, let me follow up on that for a second with a question to you, Jim. And this gets to the question about do you work from a common playbook or you start from, every case is different in specifics. Is there some kind of generic model that you sort of say, gee, we know what to do when we try to build this in a new place? Or should people going into a new context look at the local context and say, gee, we're not going to bring our lessons from the outside, but just try and build on what's there?
As I said, I think there have grown up a set of best practices. I think it's generally accepted that if you can't provide for public safety, if there's not a modicum of security, that nothing else you do will have any lasting effect. Mm-hmm. That any reforms you introduce in the economic or political realm will be washed away like sand on a beach if you haven't established some degree of security. I think there's also a recognition that rule of law means more than just reconstituting a local police force, that they have to have prisons to put people in and judges to adjudicate the trials, and that therefore you need a comprehensive approach rather than what 20 years ago we were doing, which was just building the police force. I think there's a recognition that a resumption of economic activity is important, and there are certainly successful examples of how economic activity can be stimulated and what the most cost-effective ways of doing that are in terms of stabilizing the currency, opening the system to investment and trade, and also by providing security, encouraging people to stop killing each other and go back to work. In terms of the political reforms, I think Claire is right. One does have to look at what the historic experience of the society was and not try to impose models with which they're unfamiliar and uncomfortable. But that said, as I've said, in most of these circumstances, simply going back to what they've known before is not really very suitable in many cases because they're post-colonial societies, and the only thing they can remember is colonialism, which they're not ready for. And we no longer have a real competition. I mean, the Russians aren't promoting Stalinism. The Chinese aren't promoting Maoism. They both vote for free elections every time the Security Council holds a meeting about what to do about a failed state in a peacekeeping operation. So there really is only one model, which is representative democracy, but there's a lot of permutations of that can take account of local circumstances and traditions.
Okay. Yes, over here.
Hi, my question is, so where do we stop? So Ms. Lockhart, you said that it's about them, it's not about us. It's not about our values, it's about their values. So what if we go in a country where honor killing is common, or female genital mutilation is common, and we say we're not going to get involved in that because it's too costly, or it's going to cause some friction. So where do we stop with our culture, with our values, democracy, our way of life? How much can we intrude on our lifestyle? You say it's indigenous, it's their culture, this is our culture. Same goes back to ideas of federalism or nation state in itself. It's a model. But what about models based on religion? Islam has been advocating for them for years.
Okay. So how much local content should there be? You want to take this, Raman? You just look like you were getting it.
No. I mean, I think that I would agree, that one of my concerns about state building as it's practiced, not necessarily as as it should be practiced, is that it does tend to be very prescriptive, and that there needs to be a far greater degree of flexibility in allowing local innovations and allowing local models and traditions and practices to emerge. And until we find a way to do that, I think that again, this question of imperialism is going to continue to raise its ugly head, because state building does look like the imposition of a Western model on countries that may or may not want that.
Yeah, but what about the tough choices? I mean, Claire, you said, it's wonderful. They get together at the meetings and they all want their girls to go to school. Well, what if they don't want their girls to go to school? What, would the British right to get rid of sati? I mean, what if the local practices that the local power sources want are things that everybody else outside the local power places find abhorrent?
I agree, and it's a fundamentally difficult question. Where are the red lines? Are there a set of universal values that organizations like the UN will seek to enforce, or that countries unilaterally will seek to impose? And where do you strike a balance pragmatically? And what's the way forward on this question? It's not going to be realistic to impose a set of values because there isn't enough force in the world, there aren't enough resources in the world to impose it. Where I'm talking about it more being about them than about us is allowing the talent, the resources, the human capital of the country to be engaged in their own efforts. A very pragmatic, quick example. In 2002 in Afghanistan, the aid agencies arrived. We were talking about changing the currency. The international aid agencies arrived and said, well, you're going to need 15,000 international bureaucrats to come into the country and change the currency for you. The Afghan leadership said, I don't think so. Went down to the money market, pulled together the hawala dealers, the money changers, said, could you do it? They said, sure, we can do it in 3 months. And they did. So it's about harnessing, allowing the domestic processes and domestic leadership to take place where it can. Where it can't, or where there's a difference in values or approach, is where the very thorny questions come.
I think the international community does impose certain standards, or at least insists on certain standards. It doesn't always impose them. One is that states have a responsibility to ensure that their territory isn't used to attack other states. That's a basic requirement of sovereignty. If you're sovereign over this territory, the rest of the world says you must ensure that that territory is not used to attack your neighbors. A second is that you can't engage in genocide or other crimes against humanity. And if you do, the international community has, in recent years, asserted a right to intervene. So there are certain standards that states are held to, or at least there's an attempt to hold them to. And certainly in the cases where states have failed and the international community has been called upon essentially to rebuild them, those kinds of standards are going to be applied. But I think experience suggests that the populations as a whole are quite comfortable with both of those standards.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions, one here and then one back there, and pair them, and then we'll have our final wrap-up before voting again. So, yes, hold on 1 second. Wait.
Samuel Centron. My question is, how do you protect ethnic minorities, such as Coptic Christians in Egypt, who were many times, or in other groups, maybe Zoroaster in Iraq, both groups of which also had very ancient cultures, very rich cultures, and are now being subjugated. For example, in Egypt, the Coptic Christians with the H1N1 flu, they killed all the pigs, which is a substantial livelihood for the Coptic Christians. And their sense of molding a nation may be different from another group in that very nation. How are those issues addressed?
Okay, and over here, there's a microphone coming.
How would you rate Soviet attempt at state building in Afghanistan, and are there any lessons NATO can draw from it now?
Okay, so protection of minorities, even when you have a sort of centralized state building project, and the lessons from the Soviet experiences in these endeavors. Have at it.
In terms of sort of protecting ethnic minorities, I think it is interesting to note that the central state building project isn't the only project that's out there. I mean, in Somalia and in other places, there have been decentralized state building efforts. And oftentimes, those can actually be more effective in protecting minority rights if you have clusters of minority communities who are then able to sort of develop their own administrations and interact in a position of equality with other regions. In Somalia, for example, the minority communities generally favor decentralized structures. They are not in favor of a central state for that reason.
Well, I think the best measure of the success of Soviet state building was the speed at which the Soviet Union fell apart into a dozen or more constituent nationalities and states as soon as the element of compulsion and the legitimacy of the Communist Party fell into question.
And so their foreign efforts were no better than their domestic ones?
I think, it's interesting. In many ways, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan were modernizers. They wanted to educate women, to take them out of Purdah, to create a more modern society. It was a modern society on a Soviet pattern rather than a Western pattern. But in many ways, they were modernizers, and in many ways, the modernizers in Afghanistan today, many of them were associated with the Soviet regime, rather than the American-supported Mujahideen insurgents, who in many cases are now our adversaries.
Claire, you
Yes, I think protection of minorities comes back to the most fundamental responsibility of statehood, which is to ensure the security, but the human security of the citizens. One of the other definitions of statehood that Dr. Ghani and I have proposed is actually defining and protecting the rights and the responsibilities of citizenship. And I think one concept that we find in practice on the ground is extremely useful to leaders in thinking about the building or the transformation of their governance and their institutions is moving away from a concept of subjects to concepts of citizenship and protection of the rights of citizens and an even-handed approach to the provision of the resources of society to citizens. On the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, I think, well, many history books have been written and many will be, but certainly the investment in human capital was one, very much agree with the ambassador, where investment did take place. Although looking at the picture books of Afghanistan in the 50s, a lot of the modernization had taken place even before the Soviet. The pictures of the country in Afghanistan really give the lie to the myth that this is a wild and ungovernable place. The standards of service delivery and of society and the civilization of the country is pretty similar to a Turkey or Jordan today. So it wasn't just the Soviet period that modernized, it was already happening.
Okay. We're going to turn to our second round of questions now. I want to thank our authors and our speakers for taking part in a wonderful discussion. You guys come on down. We'll bring the screen. Hopefully you'll get a chance to chat with them during the reception afterwards, I hope. I should say, as we're setting up the second round of questioning, these subjects are incredibly complex. There's a fascinating literature on them. An excellent starting point for going through that literature is a reading list that we had up on the FA website, What to Read on State Building. Very good selection of books, including some by our speakers. And if you want to follow these discussions, look at both FA. The Journal of Democracy also has a wonderful ongoing discussion of similar issues, and there are other good journals and publications out there. But basically, this is a subject which is going to continue to be at the forefront of U.S. foreign and security policy. So hopefully this was not the end of the discussion, but the beginning of it. So with this, let's get back to our discussion, our questions, and let's go back to question number 1. So, U.S. efforts at state building. Good, bad, together, as you wish. Have we changed anybody's minds on any of the thoughts? Not that much change dramatically, I think. Well, yeah, somewhat. Not that much. A little bit. Okay, second question. Should state building be a central element of U.S. policy in Afghanistan? No, yes, or another kind of yes. Well, yeah, partial yes. We're going to try this with Oscar dresses later, by the way. That was a joke. Tough crowd. Okay. Well, slightly more. Okay. Interesting. The most important obstacle to American success in Afghanistan is our enemies, our friends, us. Okay, a couple of people changed their minds. Next, should the United States increase its state-building efforts in troubled countries even where it's not engaged militarily? Yes, no, maybe. This assumes people are very slow to push a button. Okay. What's the proper relationship between state building and foreign aid? complimentary tea party. Okay. Should the U.S. common playbook or individual efforts? Or not at all? This is Jim versus Claire and Ronald. We'll pass out the right answers later. Okay. Well, there has been some change, so at least the discussion has been had some impact. Whether it's a good impact or a bad impact, who knows? Since their questions, of course, don't have any right answers. But we're really delighted to have had all you here. We hope the experiment with interactivity worked. We look forward to seeing you in the reception afterward. And I want to give a big hand thanking our speakers, who really are grateful. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at the next FA Live.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.